Okay, great. So I see a steady stream of people kind of coming in, but I do want to give Professor Alimi his full time. So for everyone that doesn't know me, my name is Anuj Amin. I am a PhD student here in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford. And today I'm so excited to announce Professor Alimi's talk, Ideas of Slavery in Ancient Rome. Professor Alimi is a professor at Cornell University in the Department of Classics. Most recently, his first book, Slaves of God, contends with this question of Augustine kind of defending or justifying the idea of slavery. And without further ado, I do invite Professor Alimi to give his talk. But one more thing, if anybody has a question throughout Professor Alimi's talk, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box, just kind of at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to it in the Q&A. But yes, without further ado, Professor Alimi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Penn, for the invitation to present as a part of this series, and Anuj for your excellence in coordinating all of the details. And thanks to all of you for coming to listen to this talk. I'm really grateful to be here. So where should one begin in thinking about an idea in its context? Perhaps the documents that articulate some of the concepts, attitudes, and norms surrounding the idea. So for instance, if you wanted to know something about, say, ideas of labor in industrial England, you might chase down pamphlets on this or that labor issue, or newspaper articles that reported on some event, or records of parliamentary debates. You might broaden your search to include things like poems and novels that reflect the intellectual milieu. Think of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, or Charles Dickens's Hard Times, or the poetry of William Blake. You might look at 19th century English philosophical arguments about labor. Scholars of ancient Roman slavery try to do much the same sorts of things when we're investigating ideas of slavery in ancient Rome. But we lack the cornucopia of resources that scholars of labor in industrial England enjoy. Too many of our sources have been lost. Some of our best sources are legal texts, where we find slavery functioning as a problem for jurists to negotiate. I'll have something more to say about some of these problems later. We also have some historical accounts, like Livy's History of Rome, where slaves sometimes play significant roles, and philosophical texts where slavery is sometimes a topic of analysis, and other times a kind of example which the philosopher can sort of test his intuitions about some other issue. But here's one thing we almost always lack: direct testimony from slaves about how they understand their own condition. The reasons for this are straightforward. As Chris DeWitt has argued, the texts by which we often access historical context typically reflect the concerns and attitudes of elites. And so the voices of ancient masses, of peasants and slaves, are lost to time. These voices are, of course, crucial for understanding the historical context. They are as much a part of the context as our elite voices. But if the subaltern could speak then, we cannot hear them now. Moreover, ancient Rome was a vast and complex empire. At its peak size, its area was larger than the continental United States west of the Mississippi. No one would expect ideas of some complicated concept or institution to be identical in California, Colorado, Iowa, and Texas. Regional differences, the local histories of norms and practices, geographic factors all shape our ideas. So when we are dealing with an area so vast, we can't expect to find uniformity. And on top of this, the ancient in ancient Rome could refer to a time period running from about 750 BCE to about 476 CE. So that's over 1,200 years. All of this means that someone who wants to make claims about ideas of slavery in ancient Rome must do so with some caution. First, we don't have as much documentary evidence as we would like. Second, that evidence largely excludes the voices of slaves, peasants, and the masses. And third, we are trying to make claims about a huge geographical area over a long period of time. Despite all of this, I hope to be able to say something this evening. So what I'll try to do is distill some of my work and the work of others in this space down to some features of the institution that seem to have been common across large parts of the Roman Empire and over long periods of time. And I'll try to be clear about when I'm saying something that only applies to a limited place or period. Roman law generally drew neat distinctions between slaves and citizens. Slaves were property, and as property not under their own rule, but under the rule or subject to the rule of a master, the power of a master. They could be bought and sold at the master's whim, and for this reason were excluded from the ordinary relationships we might otherwise take for granted, especially parental and spousal relationships. Someone who can, at being sold at a moment's notice, can be separated from her husband or children and can do nothing to block the separation. Orlando Patterson calls this phenomenon natal alienation. It's difficult to determine the precise size of the slave population in ancient Rome, but Walter Scheidel estimates that when Roman slavery was at its peak, about 15 to 25% of the population in Italy was enslaved. Kyle Harper estimates the population of slaves during the later Roman Empire at 10 to 15%. So these figures are better at giving us a sense of the order of magnitude rather than really precise figures, but in any case, we're talking about millions of slaves. Now, I've said that slaves were property. They were typically used as a source of labor. So many wealthy landowners depended on slaves or tenant farmers for agricultural labor. Slaves were especially common, perhaps even more common, in the domestic context, running the house, taking care of children, mending clothes, waiting on their masters and mistresses. That's not to say that slaves were only used for what people today might call unskilled labor, by which I think people mean jobs for which formal education is not required. Unlike in the antebellum United States, for instance, where many slave states made it illegal to educate slaves, in ancient Rome, some slaves were doctors and accountants, architects, and business managers. Slaves were not generally presumed to be subhuman per se. Still, they were dominated because they were property. Citizens, unlike slaves, enjoyed certain political rights and protections in virtue of their citizenship, including the rights to vote, to challenge magistrates' decisions, and the right to testify in court. All of this contributed to slaves being dominated. Slaves lacking these rights contributed to them being dominated. And so even though some laws prohibited their most brutal mistreatment, slaves generally could not hold masters who broke such laws accountable. Their lack of legal protection meant that slaves were at their master's mercy. Because Roman slaves had few means for contending with their master's domination, they were subject to all sorts of abuse. Many suffered rape and other forms of sexual exploitation. The risk for sexual abuse and exploitation was, of course, higher for female slaves than male slaves, but it was by no means non-existent for male slaves. There is a story about Nero, where it's alleged that he forced an ex-slave to undergo a sex change operation in order to take him as a wife. Many slaves died prematurely. In the city of Rome during the early empire, so this is around the 1st century in the current era, the life expectancy for a Roman slave was about 30% lower than that of a Roman citizen. Some masters undoubtedly were benevolent, but a slave's well-being was wholly contingent on the master's will. So I've emphasized this legal distinction to start, but I want to say that the legal distinction can't fully explain the differences between slaves and free. Certain free persons were also under the rule of others. One thing to keep in mind, and I'll return to this in more detail later, is that slavery was largely a domestic institution, especially in the later empire. The head of the household was called the paterfamilias. He ruled over his wife, children, and slaves. And at certain points in Roman history, the paterfamilias could sell or give away his children, just like he could sell or give away his slaves, to avoid paying legal damages or incurring a debt. So that tells us that at certain points in Roman history, patres familias had power over children similar to the kind of power Roman law said they had over slaves. Some historians have therefore identified some norms that distinguished slaves from children. For instance, social norms provided for that the paterfamilias could beat his slaves, but not his own sons. Here's why. The norm said that beating is appropriate only for people without honor. Any noble Roman would want to think of his progeny as noble, since one's children inherit one's name, class, status, reputation, and so on. So to beat your children and thus mark them as dishonorable was thereby to mark oneself as dishonorable. By contrast, slaves did not by default inherit their master's good reputation, and so they could be subject to beating. Accordingly, many masters physically abused their slaves. Slaves could be branded, caned, and most of all, they were whipped. In fact, the whip was such a salient feature of the master-slave relationship that it came to symbolize the master's rule and authority. In Roman art and literature, the image of someone holding the whip over another is typically, or at least often, meant to evoke the master-slave relationship. So I said that the legal categorization of slavery does not allow us to cleanly distinguish slaves from non-slaves in ancient Rome, since at certain points children could be bought and sold just like slaves. Neither do the norms of violence allow us to cleanly distinguish slaves from non-slaves. I want to illustrate this with an example taken from Book 9 of Augustine's Confessions. Augustine was a Christian theologian and philosopher writing at the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th. Much of his confessions narrate his life in the form of a prayer to God. And though the Confessions has until recently not generally been read as a resource for thinking about Roman slavery, Augustine's rich and textured descriptions of parts of his life provide several telling details about the institution. Augustine's parents were Monica and Patricius. Patricius probably came from a family with a relatively elite background, though by the time he was raising Augustine, much of the familial wealth was gone. He could not afford Augustine's higher schooling and needed a wealthier benefactor to help out. But Patricius was well off enough to own some slaves. And Augustine tells us that when Patricius found out that some of the slaves were gossiping about Monica behind her back, he whipped them violently. Indeed, Patricius had a reputation for being bad-tempered, more so than the other men in the town of Tagaste, where Augustine lived. This fact forms the background for the following story Augustine recounts in the Confessions. So women around Tagaste would be beaten by their husbands. They walked around the town bearing the marks of their abuse on their faces and bodies. It seems that in the town, very few women were able to avoid being beaten by their husbands. But one woman who Augustine claims never bore the marks of spousal abuse was Monica, his mother, Patricius's wife. When the other wives in the town noticed this, they were shocked because of Patricius's violent reputation. And so they asked her, "How is it that you are able to avoid getting beaten by your husband?" Monica's reply, "Behave before your husband as a slave. Don't insist on equality with him." Augustine tells this story with pride concerning his mother's humility and her savvy. For the modern reader, it's deeply disturbing. But it illustrates several things. First, many non-slaves took for granted that by violently beating one's slaves was okay. Second, many wives suffered beating at the hands of their husbands, despite the norm that beating was supposed to be reserved for slaves. And third, at least one woman, Monica, tried to resolve the second problem by reducing herself to something approaching the position of a slave. Romans told themselves a story about where slaves come from. The story can be found in legal documents like Justinian's Institutes, but also seem to be part of the broader milieu. So here's the story. The Latin word for slave is servus, and that's related to the verb servare, which means to save or to preserve. So what explains the connection between the noun servus, slave, and the verb servare, to preserve? Well, the Romans said, when Rome was expanding in its earliest days, it expanded by defeating neighboring territories in war. And as the Roman armies conquered these neighboring peoples, they were faced with a choice: vanquish the defeated or preserve their lives. Rome chose to save some and make them war captives and sell these war captives as property. To save is to servare them. The people they chose to save are servi, or slaves. Now, war captivity was probably an important source for the slave supply during at least some periods of the Roman Republic, between 500 BCE and 27 BCE. However, after 27 BCE, during the Roman imperial period, the period, by the way, for which we have better documentary evidence, war captivity does not seem to have been a meaningful source for the slave supply. Instead, by this time period, the vast majority of slaves were produced by natural reproduction, children of slaves being slaves. In addition to this, Roman law specified that a person could sell himself into slavery. Roman law prohibited kidnapping free persons and making them slaves. Although the fact that Roman law had to specify this should tell us that it sometimes happened. Laws tend to focus on restricting only those things which are at least somewhat common. Here's an instance of kidnapping and forced enslavement in practice. In the early 5th century CE, across North Africa, there seems to have been a racket of marauders who would kidnap people and sell them to slave traders. The slave traders would then take the kidnapped people across the Mediterranean and resell them to masters on the other side of the empire. This, of course, made it incredibly difficult to resecure one's freedom. You had been taken far from your home and all your personal connections, perhaps to a place where you didn't even speak the popular language. I want to say one more thing about this kidnapping racket. Doing so will complicate even more the clean distinction between slave and non-slave in Roman law. So I specified that Roman law prohibited kidnapping free persons or citizens and making them slaves. The kidnapping racket seems to have known this and intentionally exploited an ambiguity in the law. So across the Roman Empire, there was a category of people whose legal status was somewhat ambiguous. These people were known as coloni, tenant farmers. On the one hand, these tenant farmers were not slaves in the obvious sense of the term. They did not have human masters, and in this sense were technically free. Remember that the law designated as slaves those who were under the rule of a master. On the other hand, the tenant farmers were tied to land that did not belong to them and forced to work it. Since they did not own the land they worked, they could not sell it. Neither could they leave the land. In fact, one law described them as serviterae, slaves of the land. So were the tenant farmers free or slaves? Well, they were free insofar as they had no human masters, but they were not free in the sense that they lacked the rights and protections that ordinary citizens had. And this legal ambiguity made their position especially precarious. Had they been ordinary citizens, they would have been protected by the kidnapping law. Had they been ordinary slaves, they would have had masters who would work to stop them from being kidnapped. Because a slave was such dear property, masters didn't part with their slaves without a fight. But precisely because they were in this in-between state, between enslaved and free, slaves of the land, but slaves of no man, neither slave nor citizen, slave traders identified them as ideal candidates for kidnapping. They lacked protection either from the law or from masters. I want to take a brief detour for a second and just reflect on our moment. So we live in the afterlife of Atlantic slavery. And in the Atlantic slavery was racialized. By this I mean that rules for who could and couldn't be a slave were indexed to a person's race. And so one thing we might be inclined to ask in comparing modern Atlantic to ancient Roman slavery is whether race played a role in ancient Roman slavery. This is a complicated question. Historians, if you ask them, will tend to say that race played no role in ancient Roman slavery, and the reasons for this analysis are reasonable. In ancient Rome, slaves and potential slaves were not legally demarcated by characteristics like skin color or nation of origin. There was nothing in Roman law that prohibited someone of Roman origin from being a slave, and many Romans were slaves. Taken together, this lends credence to the view that ancient Roman slavery was not racialized. However, I think there is a richer and more informative, but also more complicated way of getting at the question. Part of the challenge is that asking whether race played a role in ancient slavery involves asking the implicit question, what is race? And separating out this implicit question can be useful because when scholars disagree about whether ancient Roman slavery was racialized, I think they're often implicitly disagreeing about what race is. My own views about race are evolving and developing, but I find myself compelled by the thought that in our modern context, race is a plural concept. The same word can just refer to multiple things. Sophisticated users of the English word race sometimes move between the different meanings of the term, often without knowing that we're doing so. And for each idea, one might disagree or agree that the thing the term race picks out even exists. So, for example, race is sometimes used as a biological category, such that the various races are roughly identifiable with historical human continental populations. And some philosophers of race argue that biological race, understood in this way, exists, but others deny that it in any way exists. Other times, race is said to be a social category, such that the various races are roughly identifiable with a social position that a person occupies in virtue of certain perceived biological features. And some philosophers of race argue that social races, construed in this way, exist, but others think that this understanding of race makes the category too broad to be of any use. It stops tracking the ordinary English use of the word. To add to the complication, some philosophers and historians of race have convincingly argued that modern histories of colonialism, conquest, scientific racism, and racial capitalism are crucial to the way race functions in the modern world. The late Charles Mills argued that if these histories are in fact part of what it means when we're talking about race, then there's no sense in which any ancient society could have any concept of race at all. But others think race can refer to something quite different. To give one example, Benjamin Isaac argues that we should start off with a minimal definition of racism, the separation of different groups into immutable social hierarchies. Doing so makes racism at least as old as the Greek philosophers. Races are just the names of the groups that occupy the different social strata. So you see the complexity. Isaac's very minimal definition of race might permit us to say that race did play a role in Roman slavery. During the heyday of the Republic, the slave supply, as I mentioned earlier, probably came from Rome conquering peoples in Europe and Asia and Africa. Rome's ideology of its own slave practices implies that many of Rome's slaves were either conquered foes or descendants of conquered foes. And this begins to suggest that differences of origin were in some sense implicated in ancient Roman slavery. So that's why I think the race in ancient Roman slavery question is complicated. The best way to answer it would be to first identify some of the senses of race that we care about and give an account of the meanings and uses involved in each of these senses. The next thing to do would be the very difficult historical and theoretical work necessary to discern whether any of the senses of race that we identified and accounted for in the first step were present in ancient Rome. And I think all of that is a prerequisite to figuring out whether ancient Roman slavery was racialized. I don't have strong views about what we might expect to find if we did that work, but I'm at least open to the possibility that doing so would deliver a more controversial answer, that there are at least some sensible meanings of race at play in Roman slavery. Okay. Now, I emphasized earlier that slaves were property or chattel. You might be inclined to infer from this that the law did not consider slaves humans. But I don't think that's right. I think instead that slaves presented a slew of legal puzzles precisely because the jurists understood that slaves were human beings. So I want to just give a couple examples of these puzzles. So first, slaves were legally alienated from familial bonds. A slave who gave birth to a child did not enjoy parental rights over that child. The child could be taken away from the slave by the master because the child belonged to the master. And similar alienations can be found in slave law regarding marriage. Okay, so on one hand, slaves are legally alienated from familial bonds. On the other hand, Roman law explicitly specified that slaves would be punished for parricide, the crime of intentionally killing a close relative. So this is an absurdity, right? On the one hand, slaves don't have legal familial bonds, but on the other hand, slaves are forbidden from killing the close relatives that legally speaking they don't have. An absurdity. Here's another one. The Roman imperial jurists generally agreed that a free person could not be tortured to force them to provide testimony in some case. Now, because this agreement only extended to free persons, the jurists agreed that slaves could be tortured for their testimony. So on the one hand, on the other hand, I should say, the leading light among the jurists, Ulpian, held that all evidence procured via torture was inherently unreliable. And the reason for this seems to be that if a person is being tortured, they're incentivized to give evidence not with the aim of tracking the truth, but with the aim of getting the torture to stop. For this reason, you literally cannot trust testimony procured under torture. Since slaves were persons, it must be the case, Ulpian said, that testimony procured from them was inherently unreliable. Thus, another absurdity. On the one hand, slaves may specifically be tortured for their testimony. On the other hand, slave testimony procured under torture is at best useless. My colleague Nicole Gianella is finishing up a fantastic book that analyzes some problems that slaves posed for the jurists. Some of the problems she discusses have the following structure. The jurists understood slaves to be humans. Indeed, most Romans did. When you purchased a slave, okay, try to inhabit the sort of mental space of a master. When you purchased a slave, you weren't just purchasing a body. If you were, slaves would not be of much use. As everyone who has thought about the topic for any period of time can attest to, horses are faster, oxen are stronger, cows and goats and sheep and pigs produce better milk and meat and clothing. As far as our physical capabilities go, humans are pretty well useless compared to the animals we domesticate. Instead, the true value of the slave consists in his or her mind. When a Roman mistress delegated the care of her children to slaves, she did so because she trusted that female slaves would know how to care for their mistress's children in just the same way, and indeed with greater care and attention than they did their own children. No one would ever entrust childcare to a pig. Masters could give complicated and nuanced and subtle instructions to slaves. Take this message to this person who lives at this address. On your way back, barter for some cloth at the market, but only if you find it comparable in quality to that which we use to make our clothes. In any case, be sure to pay no more than 2 days' wages. These are the kinds of complex and nuanced tasks slaves could be commanded to do precisely because they have human minds. And that, the human mind, is the value of the slave. That's what makes slaves so much more valuable than oxen. But it is also the mind that is the hardest thing for the master to control. A slave could be mentally reluctant to be enslaved and so be inclined to run away if he be given the opportunity to do so. Or he could be mentally incapacitated, such that the value you hoped to get out of him is inaccessible to the master. Precisely because the human mind is the slave's value, and the human mind is also the least tangible part of the slave, sellers were incentivized to play up slaves' mental fitness and play down things like incapacity or unruliness. And so for this reason, the Roman jurists had to come up with all sorts of strategies to protect slave purchasers so that they would be able to enjoy the goods they hoped to enjoy when they were purchasing the slaves. Buyers, sellers, and lawyers all agreed slaves were human, all too human. This was the value they promised and the risk they posed. I want to end just by saying something about 4 ways of exiting slavery: death, running away, manumission, and revolt. The most common way to exit slavery was to die. Most enslaved people only exited slavery upon their death. As Noel Lenski puts it, for most slaves, this meant natural death, often due to overwork or abuse, but some enslaved persons chose to hasten death's approach by taking their own lives. That suicide was employed as a means of hastening death should chasten the assumption that some moderns make that Roman slavery was not terribly severe. Running away was relatively common as well, which is one reason Roman jurists put the affirmation protections in place to protect slave purchasers from sellers trying to offload slaves inclined to flee. Our English word fugitive comes from the Latin fugit, which means he or she flees or runs away. So when we speak of fugitive slaves in, for example, the United States 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, our language reflects a Roman social and legal inheritance. So troublesome was fugitive slavery that our documentary sources rather are obsessed with the problem. So masters would hire professional slave catchers to find runaways, and runaways were punished very, very harshly, sometimes by branding. Slaves were also often forced to wear collars around their necks with a tab at the base. Okay? These collars were very difficult to remove and were intended to make runaway slaves easily identifiable and to discourage slaves from running away, since a slave who did so would know that the collar would make it easier for them to be caught. Archaeologists have found almost 50 such collars dating to the 4th and 5th centuries in the current era. The most famous example is called the Zaninus collar. Inscribed on it is the phrase, fugi, teneme, cum revocavaris, zonino, occipis solidum, which means, I ran away, hold me, return me to Zaninus, and receive 1 solidum. The solidum is a Roman coin. The strength of the Roman currency varied widely across ancient Rome, which makes it difficult to identify precisely what this coin would have been worth at the time the inscription was made. But I think it's fair to say that the order of magnitude we're talking about here is something like 1 to 2 months' wages for a Roman soldier. So Zaninus was willing to pay an enormous sum of money to get his runaway slave back. Or at the very least, he wanted some people to believe that he was willing to pay that kind of money to get his slaves back. A third way to exit slavery was manumission. Manumission referred to the legal process by which an owner granted freedom to his slaves. This could happen because a slave purchased his freedom from his master, or it could happen because a master chose to free the slave for his own private reasons, perhaps out of benevolence or pity or guilt or frustration or something else. The relationship between the master and the manumitted slave merits some discussion. Manumission inaugurated a new type of relationship between the two parties. The freedman became a client of his master cum patron. He also became a quasi-son of his patron, even receiving the patron's name. Patrons were meant to help and supervise freedmen, and these social connections gave patrons a stake in their client's success. Just as a Roman nobleman would be embarrassed and his good name shamed if he had a destitute son, so would he have been embarrassed if his freed client was destitute. The last way to exit slavery I'll talk about is revolution. Romans remembered three especially famous instances of slave uprising in their histories, which today we call the Three Servile Wars. In each case, slaves rose up in the thousands or even the tens of thousands and used a variety of means to resist their enslavement. But in each case, the rebellions were defeated. The third uprising was led by a figure now familiar to us through story and song, Spartacus. But in general, slave rebellions were few and far between, and they never led to the kind of long-term emancipation we saw, for instance, in Haiti in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I hope that this overview, whirlwind though it has been of some interest. Roman law designated slaves as property, lacking the rights and privileges and protections that ordinary citizens enjoyed. Their legal status, combined with broader social norms, meant that slaves were dominated, subject to abuse and violence of all kinds. For this reason, slaves often tried to run away, and sometimes even committed suicide. Roman slavery recognized the humanity of slaves. A slave's unique value lay in her ability to use her human mind. But the slave's humanity and human mind were also the source of all kinds of legal consternation, and the legislative record reflects centuries of attempts to deal with this paradox. If we can keep all of this in view, then we can perhaps stop ourselves from slipping too much into oversimplification when we think about Roman slavery, including and especially the kind of oversimplification that the documentary evidence invites us to, because it has systematically excluded the voices of the slaves themselves. That's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Alimi. And I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please drop them. Go ahead in the chat. We have a few minutes here for Q&A, and I thought I'd go ahead and kick us off with one question that I received. So Dale Martin wrote Slavery as Salvation, and it talks about Paul's analogy of being slaves to Christ. How should we approach these types of metaphors with kind of this philosophical framework that you're arguing for in your own work? Or, how should we even kind of approach that kind of area of discussion?
Yeah, this is so great. So Martin's Martin's work on slaves of Christ in the New Testament, I think especially in 1 Corinthians, is really instructive for me. So here are maybe two lessons that I think Martin's work teaches us and ways in which it interacts with some of what I've talked about today. So one thing that Martin emphasizes is that when the writers of the New Testament epistles call themselves slaves of Christ, they are adopting a position of humility, but only kind of. They're also adopting for themselves a position of authority. And that's because the slave of someone with authority themselves carried some authority. So I was kind of hinting at this when I talked about the ways in which slaves were sometimes allowed and encouraged to perform or to act in positions that today we would call skilled labor or specialized labor. If you had an elite who had a slave for himself, the slave sort of carried an authority in part because they carried the imprimatur of the elite whom they served, and also because they were entrusted by the elite to perform some delegated tasks. So that's one element of of Martin's work that I found instructive and that hooks up nicely with what I've spoken about today. But there's another element that maybe Martin does not go into that that has been remains a sticking point for me. So here it is. So when later Christian authors, including Augustine, speak of slavery to Christ or slavery to God, they really do mean that the relationship is one of domination. So for instance, Augustine will say things like, all your life is your beating if you're a human. Humanity has been beaten since Adam was cast out from paradise like a spider. And all humans are being beaten in Adam and will be until they die. So when Augustine reads the concept of slavery to God in the New Testament, in the writings of Corinthians and other texts that Martin is pointing us to, what he does is he informs the concept with the content of the social realities that he is aware of in his day. And in the 5th century in the Roman Empire, slavery was a dominative relationship characterized by abuse, including and especially physical abuse. And so Augustine cannot avoid reading that back into the concept. Now, if the historians of slavery are right, that domination is not just a feature of the master-slave relationship in the 5th century, but is also a feature of the master-slave relationship in the 1st century, then this might suggest sort of complication to the picture, that maybe the New Testament epistle writers themselves have implicit in this in their own conceptual framework that God is entitled to violently punish God's slaves. Okay, so that's the second thing. Actually, a third thing just came to me too, which will hook up with what I mentioned about patronage. So there's an interesting verse, I think it's in Romans, I think. Paul says, don't you know that you were bought with a price? So this is an interesting image. The idea of God as master, liberating humans from slavery to sin by purchasing their debt price and taking them as his own slave. So I think that if we, and so some work in New Testament studies has argued that this image should be understood as a patronage relationship. Because when a master, as I said earlier, when a master manumitted a slave, the relationship it did not end between master and slave, but instead the new patronage relationship began. And so maybe one thing we can read into the New Testament documents that tell us about humans as slaves of God or slaves of Christ. Maybe one thing we can read into there is that the New Testament writers are meaning to identify humans as divine patrons. And so this would be sort of a third dimension of the relationship that further work in sort of slavery in this time period may be able to illuminate. So those are some thoughts on Martin's book and the New Testament epistles more generally.
That was not only exhaustive but really impressive. That was an off the cuff question. You nailed it. That was really, really great. But turning now from more of a philosophically based question, I think we have a more economic question. So someone's asked, why have slaves, which are expensive since you have to purchase the slave and then feed, house, and care for them? Wait, sorry, this question, since you have to then feed and care for them, rather than just hire non-slaves and pay them a fixed wage. So yeah, that's the question. So why hire them as opposed to the kind of non-slave?
Yeah, good. So you might think that slaves are somewhat expensive, and so why hire them or why have them at all if you could save your money by hiring non-slaves? So I think it's an open question whether in general slaves were more expensive than non-slaves. So you have to purchase them, that's true. You might have inherited your slaves. So in which case you actually wouldn't have had to purchase them. Someone may have purchased the slaves a long time ago. And indeed, because the slave supply, especially in the later empire, came mostly from natural reproduction, As long as you had female slaves of childbearing age, you had a way to have new slaves going forward that would not require you to purchase any new slaves, right? Okay, so the purchasing cost may be lower in a lot of cases than it might initially assume. Then you have the costs of feeding and housing and caring. Well, housing might not be as big a cost because a slave often just lived in your house or maybe in sort of an add-on to your house. So it's not as though you had to like build new slave quarters in general. In the normal case, right? So we're talking about normal cases of domestic slavery where maybe a master just owns one or two or three or four slaves, not the sort of large wealthy landowners who are going to own sort of maybe dozens or hundreds of slaves. Costs will be different there, and I can say something about that in a moment. Same thing with feeding for them. If you have a household where you have yourself and your wife and maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 children, so that's already 6 or 7 of you. 2 slaves, well, if the cost of feeding them is just the same as the cost of feeding every other person in the household, which it might not be, you might give your slaves less food, then we're looking at maybe just 20% or 30% of your food cost. Again, not trivial, but not necessarily an overwhelming amount. What do you get in return? In return, you get a human that can function as a tool. A remarkably useful, um, a remarkably useful good. Someone who can take care of your children at any hour of the day. Someone who can cook the food for you that you are paying for them to consume. And someone you can assign to run all kinds of errands. So slaves are actually remarkably profitable. Now, there is the case of the wealthy landowner, where in such cases the slave costs are going to be higher, and such a person is probably going to spend a lot of money purchasing slaves and may have to pay for slave housing. But in that case, they're probably employing their slaves in a productionist system, for example, growing and selling food, where the output of the slave labor is not just the sort of things that a household needs to function so they continue on to the next day, but actually some excess goods that can themselves be sold. And so slaves in this case would also probably pay for themselves. Now, it is true that because the cost of slaves over time rose significantly, we see a slight decrease, or probably, again, it's really hard to know for sure, but we probably do see a slight decrease in slavery from, let's say, the 1st century CE to the 5th century CE. So the numbers I gave earlier, where Scheidel thinks we're looking at 15 to 25%, and Harper thinks we're looking at 10 to 15%. Okay, that might suggest a sort of a small decline, and this could reflect sort of slaves becoming increasingly expensive and difficult to keep over time. And so now slavery is like maybe more of a status or partly a status thing. It's like driving an expensive car. It may not be the most cost efficient thing to do, but it's a thing that sort of marks you as a nobleman. So that might be a reason to keep slaves, even if it's not strictly profitable.
Okay, okay. And focusing now, we're going to take one more step back. I think someone's followed up here with another question is they're saying that at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about geographic and regional and temporal differences in norms, laws, and practices regarding enslavement. Could you talk a bit more about the location and production of the sources that, kind of exist for kind of, being able to make these arguments? And if this remains kind of consistent over time. So is this like diachronically a stable kind of source listing that we have? Yeah.
Good. So that's right. So the kinds of sources that I think are most consistent over time, at least in my knowledge, are the legal sources. Romans were pretty good at writing down laws and talking about the laws and analyzing the laws and reanalyzing the laws. And so we have relatively consistent documentary evidence over time when it comes to laws. Other kinds of things are more spotty. So for example, I mentioned the slave collar, which tells us the price that a master says he's willing to pay to retrieve a runaway slave. Every slave collar that we have found, as far as I know, comes from the 4th or 5th century CE. So we just don't have evidence about or at least we don't have this kind of evidence about what a slave master would be willing to pay to retrieve a slave, let's say in the 1st century CE or even earlier, right? So that's one way in which some of our sources differ. Now, there are also these geographical and regional differences. That's right. So here's one way the difference becomes sort of really salient. In a context where agricultural production is crucial for the functioning of the economy, especially in Italy and Southern Europe, more so than in Northern Africa, for the most part. The presence of wealthy landowners who own many, many slaves is going to be much greater than it is, for instance, in North Africa. Right? So this is the case where the sort of geographical facts, like how much can you actually profit by growing crops and selling them, the geographical facts shape the practices of slaveholding. And so in North Africa, the ratio of domestic slaves is significantly higher than it is in Italy. How much do we know about slavery outside of outside of sort of the city of Rome and Italy? So less, but there than we do sort of when we're talking inside Italy. But sometimes we know some things, especially that's the case when we have people who wrote a lot who didn't live in Italy. So I mentioned a couple of times Augustine. One of the reasons Augustine is so useful for helping us understand Roman slavery in the 5th century is that he just wrote a ton. He wrote like millions and millions of words. And so there's just a ton of evidence. And so for this reason, he's really, really useful for helping us learn about Roman slavery in North Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries. But when we sort of by accident or sort of because we lost the relevant texts, don't have those kinds of evidence, at least readily available, it becomes hard, or rather, it becomes harder to know more things about slavery outside of Italy in particular. But because in Italy, we sort of tend to have sort of a greater concentration of documentary evidence, we sort of often know at least a little bit over time. Maybe the picture is less spotty when we're talking about Italy.
Yeah, yeah. And just kind of following up on the fact from the fact that we have so much legal evidence. So it's often said that Roman enslaved individuals could buy and actually have their own enslaved. They could enslave themselves. How does that kind of work from the perspective of the law? Is that like its own, subsequent body? What does that kind of look like?
Are you talking about slaves owning slaves or a
Yes.
person?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, good. So this is a practice called servus vicarius, where you have the slave of a slave. And Rome is not unique in this respect. Slave society where slaves can be owned by their slaves. Okay, so how did this work? Well, maybe one way into how it works is to sort of step back and think about slave property in general, which is not something that we tend, or at least in those of us familiar with Atlantic slavery, tend to think about, because in Atlantic slavery, slaves were, for the most part, excluded from owning property. But in Roman law, a slave enjoyed what's called peculium, which is property that is not technically precisely theirs, right? It technically belongs to the master, but for all intents and purposes is at the slave's own disposal. So Roman law provided for masters to provide or to allow peculium for their slaves. And the same word, just by the way, is used to refer to the kind of money or property the son of a paterfamilias would have sort of given to him or on loan to him or sort of in his charge or something from his father. So we can understand a slave of a slave as a kind of peculium, where it's not that you, if you're a slave, directly, completely, and comprehensively own another slave as your property, but one, for all intents and purposes, has a kind of command over a slave because the command is given to you, designated to you by the person who enslaves you. And so we have a kind of status hierarchy within the household, sort of 3-level status hierarchy, where you have the master, and then you have the slave, and then if you have a sufficiently large household, the slave of a slave beneath the slave. So that's is that starting to answer that question? I'm not sure if I got it.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's understanding this kind of hierarchy is A, you're envisioning a time past, and then B, you're kind of envisioning hierarchies that, maybe don't exist today that you kind of have to wrap your mind around. So to think that this was even possible or to see kind of material evidence that spoke to it, it just kind of makes you question what exactly it might have looked like. Yeah, and and also there is one more question that I did receive here. When and this is again taking us a little bit more. I suppose it's going a bit back toward the philosophical questions that we talked about a little bit earlier. But ancient Romans, especially the Stoics, kind of had their own unique views on freedom and the self. So, like, how do these philosophical discourses, either Stoic or Epicurean, engage with or actually justify slavery? And I think you might be the perfect person to ask this question too. And kind of how do they influence the public sentiment in the policy that was later developed that we see kind of in the legal discourses?
Okay, great. So it's a very nice question, one that I'm happy to answer. So let me say something about the Stoics and the potential influence of the Stoics on Roman law. And then I'll say something about two early Christian legal discourses. And I'll try to do it all fast because I know we're running out of time.
All right.
So the Stoics did not, for the most part, did not hold that there is such a thing as a natural slave. This is important for Stoic thought. So the Stoics believed, among many other things, that ethics concerns that which is in your jurisdiction, that freedom consists in freedom from externals, by which they mean things like passions, vices, these kinds of encumbrances. And they thought that anyone who is free in this relevant way is free in the most important sense. And anyone who's not free in this relevant way is a slave in the most important sense. And so Seneca, for instance, will draw images of masters who are gluttonous and avaricious, and slaves who are kind of noble and virtuous, and invite you to say which of these really is the master and which of these really is the slave. Now, this doesn't commend emancipation or abolition, right? Because it doesn't matter on the Stoic point of view whether you were born as a slave. That's an external. And to be overly concerned with that which is not under your jurisdiction is to be a slave of the externals. And so the Stoics would say, don't worry too much about whether you're a chattel slave. Worry about whether you're virtuous. Now, we see this reflected in Roman law in the following sense. So Ulpian, again called the leading light of the imperial jurists, seems to have taken up the Stoic idea that there is no such thing as a natural slave. And so explicitly he says, and he's puzzling over this, in Roman law, we provide for slaves as a matter of civil law, but there is no such thing as a slave in natural law. Now, in the sort of post-Christian period, where natural law is sometimes understood to constrain civil law, so things like if the civil law violates the natural law, it is illegitimate. It's not an idea that's original to Christianity, but it's one that's certainly popularized in Christianity. Ulpian does not have any such anxiety. The Roman jurists were pluralists about legal authority. And so he was happy to say, civil law gives us slaves, natural law does not give us slaves. It's just two legal systems with two differing levels of authority. And this is why we have the kinds of legal contradictions that I mentioned earlier. Christians in general cannot afford themselves of this kind of legal pluralism. And so I think what you find is Christian discourses that either criticize the civil institution of slavery. So we see this in Lactantius, precisely because there are no natural slaves, so there are no legitimate civil slaves. But then we see the opposite in Augustine, an attempt to naturalize or renaturalize slavery. So God must ordain that there are some natural slaves. And this is perhaps what legitimates the civil institution of slavery. So the Stoics generate this problem, and Christians maybe resolve it in two different ways. And the Augustinian resolution seems to have been more convincing for Christians in the medieval period. But the Lactantian solution, which concludes in abolition, or not abolition, but anti-slavery, itself is one that is a non-trivial voice in the Christian tradition, and one that's perhaps worth paying more attention to.
Well, Professor Alimi, that's perfect. You nailed it right at 6 o'clock. So thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. And yeah, that was incredible.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. And thanks
All
for
right.
the question.